Welcome to Lose Lips, all the things you wanted to say but didn't know how to say it. Today's topic is the banking crisis. Once again, we have banks that are going under, and of course, legislation is looking to pull back the Trump rule, where banking regulations were actually lessened to more stringent banking rules. So you basically have these banks that were created, and I don't know if you noticed, but there are some banks that are popping up that no one's ever heard of. You can walk down to any town or wherever, and all of a sudden you don't see banks that are major name brand banks. We have these no-name banks that are now somehow failing. Case in point, SVB Bank, which is based in California, which largely supported tech startups. So a lot of people are saying that it's not unusual or wasn't even unexpected that this bank would even fail. And it's not just this bank. They expect more banks to fail sooner or later. But now, what I find interesting is that years ago, when we had the banking crisis, the government bailed these banks out. And these banks were major name brand banks. I mean, it was almost the entire banking system, not just in America, but worldwide banks were getting ready to collapse. You have the Bank of America, the Citibanks, the Wells Fargos. So at that time, the government came in and bailed these banks out. And this, I believe, was precipitated by Lehman Brothers, if I remember correctly. Now, Lehman Brothers was a huge institution, and when they collapsed, it was interesting. They knew that the collapse was going to come about. And because of this, they took what they could, and then they fled overseas to Israel. And of course, no one knew about it. The owners knew about it, and they were able to flee. The workers went to work the next morning and were surprised that everything had collapsed. This set off huge shockwaves worldwide. So at that point, stricter laws were in place so that this would not happen again, and rightfully so. When Trump came aboard, he loosened the restrictions so that smaller banks were able to enter into the game. Whether this is good for small businesses or bad, it's not my point to even say because I don't even pretend to understand about banking regulations and what they have to go through in order to protect or even to serve their customers. But with that being said, now you have us in a position now where more banks are failing, and some people are saying that this is because of the loose regulations that Trump imposed. What I find interesting is that SVB, the executors knew or foresaw that this was happening, did not tell their customers, and gave the executives not only bonuses, but they were able to clear out their money prior to anyone else having the same type of benefit. Now, I think this is where we should be concentrating on and hold these people responsible that if they know that something is happening, they should have the decency to alert their customer base that, hey, you know, you know what, something's going on. We aren't doing so well. And what I really take offense in is that they pay themselves first. So this is the bank regulation that I think that has to have an oversight. There's also been a lot of talk about creating a federal bank in the post offices where everyone is going to be protected. You can go into the post office and use these banks like an ATM or how you would normally bank or whatever. And not only that, because it would be protected by the federal government, the interest rates would actually be a lot better. I'm kind of mixed on this only because it hasn't been tried. It's very new. But what I am reading about it and what I'm hearing about it, it's actually not a bad idea. This is one way that we can protect our banking. Then I think this is going to actually be a good idea. Not only will it give oversight for the customer as to where their money is and how much the interest rates are, I think it also provides a level of normalcy that everyone is actually the same. And it wouldn't be these huge executives at the top getting bonuses that rival a year's salary to some people. And it would also provide accountability. Not only that, if you think about it, it would actually prop up the post offices, which some people estimate are actually going to decline. and are going to be disappearing. But I actually don't see that happening. I mean, because people do have to get their mail. So let's take a look at this. So if you have a federal bank, the federal government starting or creating a federal bank for all with no minimum balances, high interest rates, what's not to stop the average person from putting their money in a federal bank? But how would you go about getting loans? Would it be a federal loan? Would the rates even be lower? Thinking on this, I actually think it actually might be kind of a good idea. Not only does it provide oversight and regulations against the banking industry, it actually might place some in competition with these other banks. Now, you have to understand, in these top banks, and not even just the top banks, any bank, you have the upper echelon that are the CEOs, the VPs, and they're making these huge, huge salaries. They sit on boards, they create, they dictate down the line to all the people below them. And they get a lot of money from when you place your money into their bank. Now, in a federal bank, you don't have you don't have these executive CEOs and these executive VPs making tons and tons of money. So it's kind of like when you think about it, a federal bank can be a bank for the little people with better interest rates. So you have to ask yourself, are you willing to put your bank funds and are you willing to put your salary and your interest and your savings in a federal bank where you know what's going on as opposed to a bank that has a history where you might not get as much? It's an interesting concept. And like I said, it's brand new. I have to admit, if something like that were to happen, I would be very interested to know what type of interest rates they would have in terms of savings and in terms of, CDs or bonds or whatever. Would it be one stop all type of bank? It's very interesting concept that I'm kind of watching the wires and listening to see what's going to happen in order for this to happen in the future. I do think it might actually be a good idea. As I said, it'll be good, healthy competition. But I also wonder if these top CEOs and VPs, once they start to see their money is coming out of their bank and going into a federally backed bank and funded bank, what will they do with their own money? Will they put their own money into such a bank that they no longer have control over? I think it'd be very interesting in the banking collapse of SVP and the Republic Bank and was First Citizens buying SVB, and now you have Credit Suisse, which is also being purchased by USB. You have to wonder, these people that are at the very top, are they mismanaging funds? Why is it that these banks are collapsing? And if they are mismanaging funds, why are they paying themselves and giving themselves bonuses? They should be held accountable for these bank failures. And I think that is the concept that a lot of people need to take into consideration when dealing with the whole banking crisis. At least I do have to say that the FDIC is going to make sure that the deposits of the customers from SVB are going to be covered. But now you have a point where you're going back in history. You have another bank that is failing or has failed. And in order to prevent the severe collapse that we have before, there are certain regulations that need to be put in place. And of course, with these regulations in place, I think they should be permanent. But I also do think that in order to make sure that we don't have a complete collapse of what happened before, then things do need to change because this is ridiculous. And I don't like the fact that the second time around, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, they were able to take their money out and they paid themselves these huge monies, basically stealing prior to when the shit hit the fan. So, how do you prevent that again in terms of SVB? You can't because there were regulations largely loosened. It was a small branch. It only catered to, these tech startups or whatever. Why they didn't diversify, I don't know. But as far as I'm concerned, there has to be some type of oversight in these banking organizations to see that the money is handled well. Now there is talk about the executives at Republic Bank and SVB are going to be held accountable, and that is actually the right decision to make. But as far as I'm concerned, it's too little, too late. There should definitely be regulations in place so that these banks do not fail And I think part of the first step is to roll back the regulations so that these small banks that might not have been or had the foresight or the know-how can do such a thing again. Like I said, Trump rolled back these regulations so that there would be more banks. And you do see a lot of new banks coming forward that you might not have heard of before that are popping up. But if these are the banks that are going to be need to be bailed out, then yes, there is definitely something wrong. And prior to something like this happening again, then there definitely needs to be regulations so that these type of things do not happen in the future. I mean, it's pretty pathetic. We had a major banking crisis happening years ago. We don't need to repeat that again. I don't think we're at that level now where we're going to see like a complete collapse like we did before, and we're going to need a government bailout. But I do think now, because some of these smaller banks are failing, then regulations need to be taken in place. And we do need to have a backup plan. And maybe the answer is that we do start having a federal bank so that people have options. And I have to admit, if you have to have the federal bank, it's definitely not going to collapse. You know that. But if you have big banks such as the Citibanks and the Wells Fargos and the Bank of Americas, and people have a choice, now maybe it's the right thing to do to have some regulations where there's oversight. So overall, I think in terms of the banking crisis, I think in terms of the CEOs and the executive VPs, if we find out that they knew in advance and have paid themselves bonuses, and all of a sudden the banks do start to collapse, we definitely need to hold them accountable. And we also definitely need to take back the money that they have paid themselves in advance in lieu of preventing another collapse. Definitely oversight is needed. And I'm happy, well, not happy, but I definitely would like to see more regulations taking place. I mean, not only that, maybe you need to have with these big banks rotations of their senior leadership. Maybe that's the answer. I really don't know, but when you have senior leadership in charge of so much money and you have them not paying attention or even paying attention to what's going on and taking advantage of, then this isn't something, or these aren't people that should actually be in senior leadership. And yes, they should be held accountable. So, how do we do this? If we can regulate a federal bank, that's not to say that we can't regulate these other banks. Now, there's already a banking commission within each state. There's already a banking commission within the federal government. Why not have the federal government utilize an oversight and direct these private banks if they're going to be taking government funds? And if we're going to be able to be in a position where we might have to bail them out again, why can't we not have an oversight? We have an oversight on the judicial systems. We have oversight on the policing commissions. We have oversight on education. Why can't we not have an oversight on the banking commission and the banking that we have that everyone uses? And I'm not talking about once every 5 years or anything like that. Why is it not that the banking commission is not more directly involved with the banks that may or may not be in trouble? I mean, you have Wells Fargo that is under so much litigation right now and is trying to put a spin on themselves in a favorable light after all the litigation that they're going through. And I'm not saying that the federal government needs to go after the banks in terms of litigation, but I think that the federal government should have an oversight on banks that show profits, and even for banks that don't show profits. Maybe the answer is that banks should submit to the federal bank quarterly statements, whether it's profit or loss, either way. I do think it's time that the federal government have more of an interest and not take control, but just have more of an interest in what is going on with the banks, whether it be on a quarterly basis, whether it be on an annual basis, I don't know. But I do think now is the time that, and in light of what has happened to SVB and the Republic Bank, then we need to have more insight into what's going on with these banks. And maybe part of the answer is to roll back the requirements of banking in general so that these small little pop-up banks won't be able to fail in the future. Maybe that's one answer. I don't think that's the only answer. And I think these areas, the things that we need to start looking at in order to make sure that our banking is not only in the up and up, but that people aren't taking advantage. And this goes for the executive leadership team. This goes for the people that are getting their bonuses and not having any oversight, and they're not paying attention to the sheets and are only looking out for themselves. But there definitely needs to be change, whether it's for the little banks or whether it's for the old, well-known, established banks. Stay tuned because I'm not actually sure what's going to happen. I'm really hoping that there happens to be change this year. And I'm hoping that we nipped it in the bud and that there aren't going to be a lot more of these banks that are failing. But only time is going to tell. But one of the things it is saying is that change definitely needs to occur. With the rolling back of the banking rules, I think that's one step. But again, I do think that we need to go even further. Thanks for listening to Loose Lips, and until next time.